BEG-111. Introduction to Women's Writing. Objective, Introduction, The Way of the Feminism, and Overview, Women Writing, Trends and Development, Women Writing, Location and Genre, Perspectives of Feminist Thoughts, Women Writing, the Indian Content. Objectives: understand different aspects of and the introduction to women's writing. So, introduction. Feminist literacy criticism is reading cultural artifacts from a feminist standpoint. As a transformed the study of literary text when employed in the context of the literature, feminist criticism assesses a text by female or a male author for its literary values as well as for the representation of women characters. Across the centuries, women have been subject of innumerable reconfigurations, and with every reinscription comes the necessity of reading the space of the text. Women can both defend and defend it, and it is here the most perspective possible can be found for imagine of the future of the female subject. Plain and Seller too. The feminist literacy criticism helped resist existing literacy canons for the patriarchal ideological, political beliefs and value system, and they perpetuate. Which more often than not belong to the European white man. It has simultaneously also influenced the concomitant aspect of publishing the critical receptions with particular focus on the analysis of how the literary techniques employed by women writers and different from the perceptions of the male canon. The blossoming of the feminist theory in the past few years has also led to the new development in the field of women's writing. Activity 1. Repairing of canonical work is also followed by the retelling of the such texts. Do you think they justify representation of women character? The root of the earliest feminist discoveries have a tracing in the 18th century when Mary Wollstonecraft published a vindication of the right of the women, a work she was reversed by many fellow writers and endeavorers inspired by the nation of the equality and library that French Revolution emblematized. The work was one of the world's first sustained feminist arguments and challenged many of the conventional notions of femininity of her time. Wollstonecraft emphasized on female education, the kind which reformed solid virtues and against artificial grace, made her one of the earliest proponents of gender equality. However, unlike later day feminists, she did not seek freedom for women from the domestic sphere. Wollstonecraft effort the paralleled by Margaret Fuller in the US, for she too emphasized on the need to educate women. Unlike Wollstonecraft, however, she did not subscribe the notion of the specific gender role and sought soldier between African American and women. Another founding figure in feminine, as known as today, is Virginia Woolf, whose ideas continue to influence feminist theories even today. She was an early proponent of the notion of androgenesis, created the mind fuller too had talked about androgyny, but her notion, if it was rooted in the mysticism. Unlike Woolf, the best artists believe Woolf were always blend to the masculine and the feminine qualities, or man womanly, or woman manly, as she called Woolf. She was also the first theorist who argued the favorite of reading practice that was women critic, the kind which would allow women to read as a woman without having to employ the partial yardstick of aesthetic and values. The wave of feminism and overview. The history of feminism is usually begun with the writing of Woolscraft, followed by Fuller and Woolf, has usually been divided into three waves. The first wave, which leads to the 1813 and 1920s, was characterized by the suffrage movement dedicated to the achieve equality for women in the West. The women activities of the time also expressed their concern for such issues as property rights and the opposite to challenge marriage. An important standard of first wave feminism was Evangelical feminism, which sought to uplift to the who were considered morality fallen. Significant feminist work of literature were during the first wave included Kate Chopin, An Awakening, Carol Patrice Galvin's The Yellow Wallpaper, and Henrik Ibsen, The Doll's House, each of which ideas which the restrictive and oppressive role of women in Victorian society. The second wave of feminism roughly begins the year 1963 with the arrival of Betty Fedrin, the feminist mystique. The mantra of this wave was the personal is the political. The issue that women were dealing with on the personal front were actual political and systemic, other like Doris. Pleasing Arise, Murdoch, Margaret Durbell, Angelina Catlin, and Muriel Spark appeared on the literary scenes regarding the private and social use of women in wayward dealing. They displayed liberate women in their work who could craving their own inch both their personal and professional lives. Third wave feminism began with the 1990s and continued the present time. This way was rooted in the work of such theories in Lucia Irangre, Cambridge, Cashew, the judges Butter, largely influenced by the post-structural view of both gender and sexuality. Third wave feminism also challenged what is perceived as a failure of the previous wave. Gender was no longer a rigid so stable category, but a shifting, contingent, negotiable, and fluid entity. Various analysis categories such as class, caste, race, ethical were added to study the feminism. In the paradigmatic shift feminist criticism, third wave feminists also respond to the breakdown of category of women by the emphasis in the individual narrative different women rather than canonical narrative of the middle class white woman. Authors such as Margaret Atwood, Janette Winterson, Joy Carol Oates, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Zadie Smith became the popular women writers of the third wave. Recent women's writing has attempted to theories the act of narrator too, who voice narrative story and who voice the pay attention to, who hold authority or a narrative, who represent himself or herself, and who is represented by another person, have all become significant point of enter in the work of literature. Likewise, researchers who study feminine has also made sure that one of their major concern is their one position to relation to the population they are studying. Many 21st century critics, however, have leaving their critic against emphasis on individuality by post-feminist stated the personal is truly the political, then they focus only the individual defeat what is actually a collective program for these critics and overemphasis on different impact the development of the feminist movement in the emphasis different feminists also run the risk of focusing on certain differences such as race caste more than others such as workspace. Activity 2. Anti-aestheticism is major force in driving the different ways of feminism. What are the some of the problems concern women in the current time? Are you the different from the face of women in the previous generation? Women's writing trends and development. As a social consideration of gender began to take a shape, the seed of which were showed in the first way, the sex and gender were distinguished between feminists began to look in identify the psychological, socio-cultural and political implication of gender norms. General lender aptly summarizes this when she say women's writers as women negotiate their divided loyalty and double consciousness both within the without social and cultural arrangement. The tendency to look the certain behaviors and action as a beginning typical to the particular gender result in women writers. Beginning double bind, they were expected to limit their writing to those areas of which they had first. Hand experience while the domestic sphere, but the rather clever distortion of the reason. When they would stick the convention feminine topic, they were accused of being self-service and parochial as well as profile. Author Margaret Atwood had seen when men write about things like doing the dishes. It is realism when the woman does. In unfortunate feminine gender limitation, realism when the woman does. It is unforgettable feminine gender limitation. In their 19th century period, women's writers were women before and writers later. The women's writers had to often resort to using male norms and plumb if they wishes to the assert solid uniqueness of the writing and not for writing well only when compare the women's writers of their time. The awareness then that their literacy brilliance of the neglect ongoing to the many stereotypes that they attach to the gender served as a perpetual source and vexatious of women's writers. Women's writers have strong role to play to undoing the implication. In fact, the untake of the women's writing as a distinct literacy culture. Since that few declines has been manifold, this trend has been given rise to the whole set of literary studies which specifically cater to women's text. However, there are certain critics who oppose the employees of the term. Women's writing standing that is a privilege and other gender or here the literacy product, almost suggesting that the privilege is a compensation for the wrong that they have suffered. Nevertheless, traditional marginalized by men, women in their capacity as a writer. We have a change not only the conventional structure of power and dominance, but also notion what compare lecture, their employment, the unconventional literary mode, narrative techniques, dictation and style has led to the certain of the pre-generate the women writers the occupy the unique position when compared the men writing. The writing was inevitably then become men is empower women. One of the most popular theme of women's writing is avoid the express and value women's own the view about themselves as well as the world around them. Over the years, women's writing has bravely progressed towards the explore of the women's identity. In the women's writers' refusion of masculine literary tradition, they have steadily moved towards a literature that is engrossed with the inner space and the room of the one of own was significant symbol of the same. Women's writer located in genre. If they examine the major writers of 19th century England was see that host of the women's writers like Mary Shelley, Charlotte Bronte, George Eliot, Kate Chopin, Elizabeth Galley, Emmy Brown, and Marina Edwards, among others, have written work which has groundbreaking for the age which they were written. They were these work of the past few decades. They being look of the presaging the issue theme of later day feminine equality. Even more revolutionary were work with American novelists of about same time such as Lucia May Alcott, Charlotte Parkin Gilman, Rebecca Harding Davis, and Winfried Holby. In their seminal study of 19th century women's novelists, Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gilbert state the major thematical occurred in the 19th century was the woman question for self definition. At the turn of the 20th century, women's writers who wrote novel and prose pieces adopted new literary approaches and experimented with the narrative techniques and style uh, disjointed, non-linear narratives marked by analysis and prolapsis, especially addressed to those issues where earliest swept under the carpet, such as women's sexual desire, sexual violence, same-sex desire, and women's psychology. Writer began to explore how to unfill in the traditional role of a daughter, wife, and mother can be, how to romantic engagement and marriage cannot be women's only dream. According to Elizabethan folk Genovese, modern women's rights have been especially interested in the women alone. The lovers and husbands of their heroes clearly play the second role, not in the travelized mode of narcissistic fantastic on underdeveloped character to the country. These men are finally declined, but the particular figure among many in the difficult lives of struggling women. Women poets of the time, like prosodic counterparts, also embrace a new literary mode, charging their work with a unique styling and structural character, using the poem is physical structure as a mean to challenge and traditional literary forms. Poets like Carol Rumans and Anne Wickham in England in Marine Moore and Hilda Delight in American have posed a vertical challenge to the mainstream literary tradition. Even so, they were trading to thin ice her because while writing in a distinct manner as they could, they also had carefully avoid being too personal rather than universal because they had to rely on mainstream literary circle for getting published and being held in esteem. However, as the time progressed, women writers who were financially independent starting their own printing press, journal and magazine. The 20th century also witnessed a massive output of African American literature. African American writer texts were characterized by different issues. They those of the writers, white writers of the period. Authors like Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, Maya Angelou, and Zora Neale Hurston produced work the focus of issues of rational injustice, rigid standard of beauty, desire, motherhood, interpersonal relationship, misogyny, gender role, violence, innocence, community and society, and God. The Satwal what black woman writer inspired the whole genre of young novelists such as Toni Cat Bambara and Gloria Naileron. Black family instead of the needs include analysis categories of race and family argument. Thicker like Partial Hill Colline, Hortel Spiller, and Hazel Carbe were the pioneer of the black feminist thought. Post-colonial feminine which emerged soon after when a step forward and extended the concern of black feminists to the issue faced by Chicano and Asian American women as well as the women of the culture nation. Activity 3. Women's writers in the 19th century often resort to the using pseudonymy and anonymity to avoid the label of women's writer and to have the wider relationship. Do you think the emergence of women's writer have distinct genre hinder the reception in the zone of mainstream literature and render women's writing as they belong to the other perspectives in feminine thoughts? Since 1970 and 1980s, there have been show of critical work that analyzing women's writers in terms of the growing body of feminist thought. French feminine in particular, which are during 1970s. The work is Julia Kristeva, Helen Cautious, and Lucy Irigaray has extended explored feminine subjectively, drawing upon psychoanalysis, social challenges the tendency towards the phallogenerism in the literature and instead suggested how the only the forward was the overthrow hierarchies of language prevalent in the androcentric society. She conceptual men, women as A and B or as independent entities rather than A and A. Woman would longer be the other of men. Kartiva likewise suggested that since women could not become a active part of the symbolic order, the writing expressed themselves in the for the poetic language which she refers to the genotext. For they evade norms of language, the realism that language is an instrument of oppression in the hand of partiality was one of the major development in the feminist through in 1980s. Language has been credited by many feminists as a position, a power which allows to the control social relation in ways we are not privy to. Distinguish partial ideology in mislead rhetoric deals Spender in her work. Man-made language meditated at the length on how, unlike declaration and assertive manner of men writing, women's writing was almost too different and the apology in its town. Since then, language has been credited by many feminists as a possible in power which allows in the control social relations in way where are not private to. Spender goes into also highlight how the connection to the masculine forward world tend the more positive when compared with their feminine counterpart. And she stated the example of the master mistress word pair to emphasize the same. With language inevitably skewed in the favor of men, the obvious task before women's writers was to develop a language that was their own. Writers of the last 3 decades of the 20th century like Janet Vincent, Angela Cart, Way Weldon, and Kathleen Acker, among others, reflect the Helen Cautious described as the ensure feminine, the laugh of the Medusa. Their writing reflect a female consequence which bring into the being style themselves distinct trophy instead of distinct of the male writers use the mythical language puns for play, the even visual alternatives such as hippens and parasitary become common. Their characters were more fluid and difficult characters. Janate Watterson, for example, create characteristics marked by certain gender fluidity. Angelina Carter tried to subvert the partial through the uses of magic realism and thought showing absent father figure and focus in mother-daughter relationship. In fact, the emphasis on gender fluency in the work of these writers and critics set the stages of gender queer theories of the 21st century. Activity 4. Can you think some other ways of using language employed by women writers to priority and oppress in the trauma of women's character? Another seminal work of 1970s was a literature of their own by Ellen Scholver. Scholver effect divided in the literature culture of feminine movement in 3 phases. That is the feminine, the feminist, the female. Apparent characters represent issue, trope, symbol, and style of women's writing. She also coined the term genocriticism to underline the employment of feminist frame of the analysis of women's writing. Certain who worked like Simone Beauvoir and Second Sex, Betty Friedan, and feminine Mischievous Cat, Miller, Sexual Polite, and Judas Bell, Gender Trouble, Feminism, and Subversion of Identity has influenced literature written by women across the world. The task of feminist literacy criticism is the call into the question and legacy of masculine literacy, aesthetic, and the values that have assumed by both male and female writers. In the words of Anate Colande, it pays attention to the ways in which particular male structure of power in Scrabble or encoder with the literacy inheritance, the consequence of the encoding for women as a character, as a reader, and as a writer. Most feminists would agree with the fact literature serves as an important instrument of the perspective of unequal power relations in the society by popularizing the reinforcing stereotypical proportion of women which usually fall into the categories that of the uh, angelic mother and the pedantry, sadicrus, literatus, naturalize. These role making them acceptable and worthy of the girl who are exposed to such texts. Can you trace some examples of the portrayal of the power of the woman and mechanism of the controlling them? Some of the most invested criticism in the feminist has been directed by in the way the female body is perceived, specifically at the notion and what an idea feminine body should look like, what are the fitness feminine behavior, which the body must be tried to the practice, and also her reproduction in biology. In fact, the repetition performed a certain role and prescribed by the culture specific description. The make a body generate an idea exploring the length by Judith Butler. Consequent, a lot of research has been done of the feminist thinkers and field of the ethic of embodiment. Failures to the embody a certain gender, class, race, or other social construction in thus seen in most cases as a transigenous with ultimate leads to them beginning marked for oppression and or ostracism. One such philosopher, Gail Willis Point, specific feminist philosopher, critical race scholars, and disability theorists who illustrate and ultimate combat the insidious way in which sexism, racism, and condemnable bodiness ensures improvement and living experience of both oppression and oppressed, largely by the predetermination of meaning of their body interaction in according with the institutional cultural expectation and norms. Women's writing in Indian context. With cultural norms become important concern with the feminist inequality. റിമോട്ട് എവിടെ അദീന ആ അതിൽ എ സിയുടെ റിമോട്ട് എ സിയുടെ റിമോട്ട് എവിടെ Women's writing the Indian context. Within cultural norms become an important concern with feminist inequality. The needs for feminist and cultural theories that could cater to needs of specific group of women, intersection of feminine, such as black, Indian, lower caste women, etc., was deeply felt to the street clear of essentialism and of the oversimplification of experience of women became a major focus. The influence of Western feminist philosophy has been unmissable in the ways of Indian feminism has taken space, but the critical theory of first world countries are absolutely diverse. The criticism of women who are oppression at the grassroots, the whole idea began feminism without border is to widen the scope of feminism and to the privileged feminist theories about the white middle class woman. In thus emphasize on the need of main culture specifically when taking about women's experience expressions. To state an example, the 19th century Britain and America, the problems addressed to feminists include the right of vote, to be the free from wearing corset, to all of the whole meaningful occupation outside the home, etc. At about the same time, Indian feminism encounters such as Cosber abolishing of the uh, practice of sati, child marriage, female infanticide, restriction on female education, inheritance laws, etc. Even then, the reformatory effort they were largely limited to upper class and mostly Brahmin women. It was only the latter the issues like women's health, domestic abuse, wage, linguistic, and right of the tribal and Delta women were acknowledged, such as widespread disappeared in the issues being addressed. Speak volume about the needs for the cultural specific feminism and women's writing. Hence, the syllabus of their paper has been designed in a manner that take into account the various perspectives of women's writing to highlight the richness and diversity of women's voice across the temporal and spatial boundaries. It brings together in a spectrum of text by and about women. The word of literature in Indian uh, subcontinent was for the long marked by an overpowering presence of male writers, with a woman appears on the scale late and garnering popularity and critical acclaim even later, when also the under the feminist state the top of having a voice and being listened to generally service as a symbol of agency, a trend which was originally being understood a masculine attribute. Most contemporary Indian women's writers has emphasized on the woman as an individual is on her stand, attaining to give her woman characters the freedom of self-definition or in some cases self-ratification. In later half of the 20th century were like Kamala Markandeya, Anita Desai, Shashi Deshpande, Nayantara Shagawal, Geeta Hariharan, among others, become popular of exploit middle class women's constitutive fulfillment. But there were others like Isman Chukti, Amrita Prital, Krishna Sobi, Gaura Pat, Rashida Jahan, who had dealt with women's issues with conventionally at the regions of per independent India as well. The Bhakti tradition has also been an indelible strength in Indian religious and literary recipe in the writing of women's Bhakti poet like Akka Mahadevi, Andal, Janabai, Mirabai, Lalde, and Behinabai can be seen as a earlier many facets of autonomy in liberty in the face of the arbitrary and arbitrary religious autography authority of the highest caste Brahmins made. Active resistance as a opposed to the passive accepting oppression has become one of the major hallmarks of modern Indian women's writer. They have rigid there through the work is important bring the women into the category of human authority like Mahvashara Devi and Arundhati Roy have the managed to bridge the gap between activism and academy has employed their work with fiction and voice of concern about marginalized communities such as women, Dalit, transgender tribes, and have also lead their studies criticism against bureaucrats, policymaker, policy officer, and upper caste men. Modern day criticism writers like Navidai Menon and Namida Gohe have dealt with other issues such as theatre, that is, political posture of women empowerment, sexual harassment in the workplace, politicalized with the household, intersectionality and queer identity. Activity writers like Lakshmi Narayanan Tirupati, the first strangers to represent Isohar community at the United Nations organization, and Akka Revadi, the first trans person write the autography, has also contributed to the imaginary of the circumstance and status of gender queer peer in India. However, queer theory embraced the West in 1990s. In the most of the world identify the queer theory. In Indian today is a interpreter of the views of Western theories rather than it being culture specific frame. Feminism in India has come a long way with the setting upon the center of the research, governed especially of a women, women's organization, NGOs, fitting domestic violence and child abuse, and pointer of the women journey such as Indian Journal Gender Studies, ANT, Antyajaya, critics and scholars like Rajeshwari Sundaraja, Susi Taru, Gukum Sangir, K. Lalita, Nar Yuvani Devasi, and Chandra Mohanty has published politically informed and the non-work of the feminist equality rooted in Indian context. Not only many critics are the opinion of the feminists in India still having a long way of the, especially with the respect to the intertwined area criticism and interpretation. In India, the ideas of the nation and the home suffers time and agent when examine issue related to gender. Critics like Patra Chatterjee and Subhida Kaviraj an emphasis on how to India was marked the domain of women. They were responsible of maintaining the home purity and sanctity. The outside, of the other hand, was main domain is a part of their task was shaded inside from the corruption of influence the outside, especially during the colonial regime, like the passion of looking at the nation as it began synonymous with the mother figure has been the source of debate among the feminine critics. Many of they have argued that allows the men to the control the women and the country under the guidance of shield has a have harms. Further, even if the nation state promise certain right of women, these rights are to conflict with the personal laws their communities and latter often take precedence over the format. Gayatri Sobiga used the term ascendism, Resident 22, in including the manner in which the men of the house try to exert the much control within the house by regular female desire. The ascetic self-control was supposed perspective a center ideas of womanhood employed by such mythical figures Sita and Savitri, Nira, Yuvai, Devai, as also suggested, the women are considered and symbolic bears in the community's identity and honor, both personal and collective. Consequently, any moral landscape and their parts of trend more harshly. The central of the family and the community give a rise of important challenge. Indian feminist autonomy in liberty of the women in India needs to be established in a manner that does not state the form of family, community, and culture. Modern feminists have also tried engage with the issue related to sex work. While many have considered in an extension of patriarchy, crime against women and their tendency to relegate women of the state of mere object, they have suggested sex work should not be treated differently than they occur professional and should be seen as what it is. Work in strictly science, the women's never make in a mainstream feminism, gender violence against the women often overlooked. The collective community standards in the present life is restriction is a woman writer expression their reality discuss. Women's writing across the world in India has been since the beginning also seen trend of autobiographical and semi-autobiographical writers to stand the general the other half of the 20th century when authentic realism. Feminine readers practice stress on the importance of knowledge about the experience of other women through the literacy which would feed in the understanding of their own lives. Such intellectually engaged with the life of other women helping women's reader make sense of other own life. By examining the woman represent the literary text, we can analyze how to employ these texts challenge narrative and impose them the society. Feminist theory therefore concern themselves with not only the women the writers produce text also the reader and the consumer like the Western contempt autobiography writer and women in India have been and all the increasing critical and scholars attention. Feminism today's times and sprawling manifolding academic and political concept in instead of being changing oriented rather than being simply and theoretical framework devotes partial application. Feminists argue against the certain academic field instead of integrate with the field of knowledge and ensure the inclusion of the feminist values in the field of research is an important maneuver. The ultimate aim of the create and the space in opportunity to unreveal the perspective inequality present in the society and struggle way of dealing with the same most critical work. Have therefore tried to engage with the maternity of text that with the work non-fictional aspect or work ground in reality. Later day mainstream have actually suggested the matrical began to the force things and matter over the years. Feminists have moved of the limiting scope of encounter more critical understanding of the woman's experience. Not only different type of feminine liberty, Marxist, social, ecological, cyber, etc. But every meaning of the term feminist is open to debate and negotiate for family behavior, celebrate empathy upon by become woman, a notion of gender personality.